Did you know Japanese fans who pre-ordered The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time got these Ocarina poker cards, with 2 links as jokers and this legendary art as the card backs? They were never sold in stores, which was also the case for these pre-order exclusive Banjo-Kazooie cards. Nintendo's history making poker cards is even more interesting. According to Nintendo spokesman Yoshio Hongo, Nintendo started making poker cards around the time of the Russo-Japanese War, from 1904 to 1905. The story goes that there were Russian prisoners of war being held at Tofukuji Temple near Nintendo headquarters, and that led Nintendo to start making poker cards. Nowadays, we also make Pokémon cards at our poker factory. The company was actually founded in 1889 as Nintendo Koppai, which means Nintendo playing cards. Back then, 15 years before they made poker cards for Russian POWs, Nintendo made Japanese-style cards like Hanafuda, which were mostly sold in gaming parlors run by the Yakuza. Other card manufacturers didn't want to associate with criminals and left the business, but Nintendo founder Fusajiro Yamauchi wasn't scared of the stigma and used the opportunity to corner the Hanafuda market. These stories about pre-orders and poker cards were shared in 1990s issues of Japanese magazine 64 Dream. Every month, Nintendo spokesman and PR head Yoshio Hongo would spend 8 pages fielding fans' questions, and over 5 years answered well over 1,000 in a section called the Teach Me Hongo-san N64 question box. We had all those pages translated and covered the game-related trivia in our last video. But today we'll look at what he had to say about the console itself, and Nintendo as a company during the N64 era. Like, who designed the N64? In the early days of Hongo's question pages, a fan asked exactly that. Hongo said it was an industrial designer in his 30s but can't disclose his name, since he's a private individual who shouldn't be subjected to mass media attention. Apparently something changed behind the scenes though, because a few years later when someone asked the same question, Hongo finally revealed the designer's identity: Kenichiro Ashida. Not only did he design the look of the N64 and its packaging, he also designed the new style Famicom and NES, the Super Famicom, the Super Nintendo, and the 64DD. What a legend! As for the console's name, it was originally called Ultra 64, but Earthbound creator Shigesato Itoi suggested changing the name to Nintendo 64. Nintendo president Yamauchi agreed, and the rest is history. Another reader asks what the NUS on the bottom of the N64 means. Hongo says it's the product code, which stands for Nintendo Ultra 64, derived from its early moniker. Likewise, he says the Famicom's underside has HVC, for Home Video Computer. Super Famicom is SHVC, for Super Home Video Computer. You can probably deduce the overseas version's acronyms for yourself: NES and SNS. The Game Boy's DMG is a bit less obvious, standing for Dot Matrix Game. Game Boy Pocket, also known as Game Boy Light, has MGB on the back, for Mini Game Boy, CGBs for Color Game Boy, and AGBs for Advanced Game Boy. Virtual Boy's VUE was maybe a bit optimistic, standing for Virtual Utopia Experience. Later hardware had similar abbreviations, but some meanings were never explained, like the HAC on Switch. In another issue, someone asks how many countries the N64 has been released in. Hongo says Nintendo doesn't even know, since a lot of console sales are indirect, with distributors operating independently. More interesting though is the tangent he veers into next, about the Hyundai Comboy 64. In the 90s, South Korea had a trade embargo against Japan, mostly due to tensions left over from early century atrocities. As a result, Nintendo couldn't do business there. So, to get around the embargo, they partnered with Hyundai, the guys you mostly think of as a car company, to make a legally distinct not Nintendo 64 that could be sold in Korea. They had to change the name, so they called it the Comboy 64. It's mostly the same as an American console except the branding, and can even play American cartridges with a little tinkering. Due to all the complications though, the Comboy 64 sold for a whopping $420, with Mario and Mario Kart as its 2 launch titles. Japan and Korea buried the hatchet a few months later, which meant regular old N64s were now allowed into the country, and that's what most Korean gamers ended up buying. And thus the Comboy 64 became a pretty rare variant, and hard to get your hands on nowadays. Previously, there had also been the Hyundai Comboy, Super Comboy, and Mini Comboy, which are basically the Korean versions of the NES, Super Famicom, and Game Boy. After the embargo lifted, the Comboy brand didn't need to exist anymore, so future consoles like GameCube released unchanged. Chinese Nintendo systems have a similar history, with the Middle Kingdom using the IQ player instead of the N64, for example. We're not going to dwell on it here though, since we already covered it in depth 5 years ago. So if you want to hear more about those systems, check out our video on Nintendo's history in China. Back in the day, Nintendo'd send out double-sized development cartridges to gaming magazines for previews, reviews, stuff like that. One reader asks what happens to those carts when magazines are done with them. Do they get thrown out? Hongo says they cost 40 to 50,000 yen, which is about $400 US, so they need to get mailed back to Nintendo and reused. They're actually flash carts, like the Nintendo Power cartridges we talked about in a recent video, and thus they can be rewritten over and over. Nintendo writes a new game onto it, then sends it back out for more reviews next time. Another reader asks what would happen if a magazine employee with one of those carts leaked the game. They'd probably get torn limb from limb, says Hongo. They have numbers inserted into their programming. For example, if a leaked ROM started going around overseas, we could search the programming to find that number and see, oh, so it was this particular magazine who leaked it. Another interesting cartridge variant is the Wide Boy 64. Hongo says they were all handmade by Intelligent Systems because there weren't very many of them. They let you play Game Boy on an N64, and later models even let you play Game Boy Advance games. Wide Boys were never made available for sale to the public. Instead, they were mostly for devs making portable games, who wanted to see what they'd look like on a big screen TV. Magazine reviewers got them too, so they could take quality photos that would have been impossible on a tiny screen. The N64 transfer pack was available to the public, but it was only compatible with about 20 Game Boy games, and no Game Boy Advance. Wide Boys could play everything, and cost about $400 to make, with some basic features like changing the aspect ratio and zooming in and out. At one point, Hongo says they're considering making a consumer version that was smaller in size, added extra functions, and most importantly, was cheaper thanks to mass production. But ultimately, Nintendo never released it. As a result, Wide Boys are a tricky find for collectors nowadays, and hardly ever go up for sale. If you find one for under $1,000, consider yourself lucky. Earlier, more primitive Wide Boy variants also existed for Famicom and Super Famicom, but couldn't play Game Boy Color or Advance games, of course. One reader asks why N64 doesn't have a startup screen. The PlayStation, after all, had an awesome startup. Hongo says PlayStation CD-ROMs take time to load, so they have to use a startup to mask the wait time. N64 cartridges don't have that problem, which is why you can get right into the game without waiting. Most games do have a very quick logo pop up though. Hongo says it's called the N-Cube, and explains its symbolism. First of all, unlike PlayStation's logo, the N-Cube's a 3D shape, meant to signify Nintendo's jump to 3 dimensions. As for its colors, he says they're based on the controller bros. That's what Nintendo called the controller color options available at launch. The N-Cube's also a shape with exactly 64 sides and 64 vertices, which Hongo doesn't mention, but Nintendo undoubtedly implemented very deliberately. When N64 came out, sales fell far below Nintendo's expectations, especially in Japan. Not only were they losing the current console war, but N64s were selling just 1/3 what the Super Famicom had in its early years. So Hongo announced that in April '98, they were gonna turn things around with what they called the N64 doubling plan. He said, "It's a statement of Nintendo's determination to promote the N64 and double its sales as an immediate goal. So we're producing commercials that make gamers think the N64 is doing well, and that Nintendo's changed." Besides the new marketing strategy, they also cut the console's price in half. At launch, it was $200. Then they dropped it to $140. Then all the way down to $100. Extra controllers were bundled in for free, and greatest hits were discounted to $40. Games like Mario 64, Mario Kart, Star Fox, and GoldenEye. So was the doubling plan a success? No. In fact, sales barely budged at all. This number here was supposed to be double, but only went up a measly 9%. Nintendo'd taken a lot of the same measures overseas with price drops and all the rest, but if you look at worldwide sales, you'll see they actually dropped that year. The N64 just couldn't escape its downward spiral, as huge franchises like Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest jumped ship to Sony's CD format, and new ones like Crash Bandicoot and Resident Evil were birthed exclusively on PlayStation. Nintendo's next system, the GameCube, was even worse, but that's a story for another day. Some facts about Nintendo itself during the N64 era were covered in these pages as well. Nintendo had offices in Kyoto and Tokyo, both expensive cities to live in, so employees were offered heavily discounted dormitories with rent of just 10,000 yen, or about $80 a month. Married couples paid double, so about $160. Single people got kicked out when they turned 30 though. For its employees' enjoyment, Nintendo had a ski club, which Hongo was a member of for a couple years. There were also tennis, shogi, and tea ceremony clubs. In the 90s, the company was about 80% men and 20% women, with most women working in admin rather than development, because, quote, "The hours of development are unpredictable and sometimes late into the night, so it's rare that women are assigned to work there, though a few are hired in the design and music fields." Back then, the company had about 1,000 employees in Japan and 1,500 overseas for a total headcount of 2,500. Nowadays, they have nearly 3,000 in Japan, 5,000 abroad, for a total of 8,000 employees, meaning they've tripled in size since the 90s and are currently still hiring. One reader inquires about the uniforms they've seen Nintendo employees wearing and asks if they can buy one. Hongo says absolutely not. It could lead to outsiders sneaking into the development area. Nintendo takes very strict care of those uniforms. If an employee gains weight and doesn't fit in their uniform anymore, the company takes it away and saves it for a future employee who will be the right size. Nintendo lends every employee 2 uniforms when hired, but retains ownership. They're never sold, and when someone quits or retires, they have to return both uniforms they were lent. Nintendo was very careful to make sure no one got their hands on one, for fear they'd see how the 64 sauce gets made. And in case you're wondering, yes, they're still wearing them to this day. If you've ever beaten a Nintendo game, you might have seen a special thanks for the Mario Club in the credits. Maybe you've got a vague idea they're playtesters or something like that. In several issues, Hongo goes into specifics about who they are and what they do. He says they're a dedicated evaluation team, made up of about 100 people living in Kyoto, mostly college students, freelancers, and housewives. They work part-time, usually 4 days a week, from 10 a.m. to 5:30. They do play test and check for bugs, but perhaps more importantly, they also decide if games are good enough to release. The club started in the NES era for judging first-party games, and third parties could have their games too, if they wanted. But with the launch of N64, the club got a lot more serious. Every game had to get checked by its members, whether it was made by Nintendo or not. They scored games from 1 to 100, grading primarily on 5 criteria: visuals, sound, playability, gameplay, and satisfaction. If the Mario Club didn't think your game's at least a 70 or 80, Nintendo wouldn't let you release it on their console. The club would send notes back to the devs saying what was wrong with it, what they could change to improve their score, or failing that, the game would just get thrown in the trash. In addition to the Mario Club, Nintendo's employees as kids were used as playtesters too. For example, if they wanted to know what kindergartners thought of a game. According to Hongo, Nintendo kept track of which employees had kids and what ages they were, so they could efficiently make use of child evaluators. They were, however, unpaid labor. They didn't even get free games. Hongo says the children were offered 10% discounts compared to full retail pricing, but admits they could probably get a better deal at everyday game stores. You might remember a story in our old Mario 64 video where Miyamoto had some kids play test Mario 64, including his own son, who kept trying to climb an unclimbable hill. Miyamoto openly wondered, geez, does this kid have any brains? We also found a couple interesting tidbits about the 64DD in Hongo's Q&A pages, which conflict with or clarify what we reported in our recent 2-hour disk drive video. We'd said 64DDs were only available by mail order, though some unconfirmed reports claimed they were eventually also sold in stores. We managed to find confirmation from Hongo, who says 64DDs were in stores starting from February 2000, just 2 months after the mail order campaign. Nintendo made 100,000 disk drives, but only 15,000 customers bought them by mail. So rather than throw the rest in the trash, they sold a bunch to game shops. Therefore, the off-cited figure that only 15,000 64DDs were ever sold is an underestimate, though it's unclear of how many of those 100,000 were ever bought by customers. We also need to issue a correction. Donkey Kong 64 is often claimed to have been called Ultra Donkey Kong while it was in development. Before, we said it didn't appear that was actually true, that the name was probably made up by the press because the devs at Rare said it simply didn't have a name at that point in time. But it turns out, Hongo does refer to it as Ultra Donkey Kong on 10 occasions, from January 98 to January 2000. In that last issue, he explains the name change. Quote, "It used to be called Ultra Donkey Kong, but now that there is a Donkey Kong cartoon series and a card game being released, we decided on Donkey Kong 64 to make it clear it's an N64 game. Also, with the new Donkey Kong Game Boy game coming out early next year, it would be a bit complicated, and that's why we added 64 to the title." The cartoon he's talking about was a Canada-France production, and broadcast from 1996 to 2000. The Game Boy game was Donkey Kong Land 3, which came out in '97, but didn't release in Japan till 2000. They may have played it late, but to make up, they got a color version while us foreigners were still stuck in black and white. And the card game you're less likely to have heard of. It was a completely original TCG starting in '99, kinda like Pokemon cards with booster packs, holographics, and its own unique rule set. Donkey Kong cards continued into 2000, with an expansion specially devoted to Donkey Kong 64. So what Hongo's saying is with all those games coming out around the same time, they felt they had to change the console title to Donkey Kong 64, to make sure people knew it was an N64 game. So apologies for that error on our part. Nintendo was calling it Ultra Donkey Kong originally. We hadn't translated all these 1,000+ Hongo questions when we made the 64DD video. On that same page, Hongo reveals some interesting lore for how Donkey Kong got his name, and how he was almost a samurai. If you're a Nintendo trivia addict, you've probably heard the story before, that Miyamoto wanted to convey he's a stupid ape, so he looked up stupid in his Japanese-English dictionary, which said donkey was a synonym, and that's how he came up with the name Donkey Kong. Hongo tells a different version though, with some extra info. Quote, "Actually, it was me who named him. Or rather, it was me who looked things up in the dictionary and chose it. The arcade version of Donkey Kong came out in 1981, the same year I joined Nintendo. As a new employee, I was assigned to the General Affairs Department, and as part of checking game titles for copyright, I'd suggest my own ideas. When I looked up foolish in the dictionary, the word donkey came up, and I thought calling him Donkey Kong would have a nice ring to it. There was also a comedy band called the Donkey Quartet at the time, so I offered it as a suggestion, and ultimately that name got picked." Hongo goes on to say that Miyamoto's suggestion was to have him wear a zukin and called him Kurama Kong. It would have been a reference to Kurama Tengu, an old Japanese book and film series starring a zukin-wearing samurai. This right here is a zukin. So basically, Miyamoto almost made Donkey Kong a samurai, which Hongo goes on record saying would have been ridiculous. Keep in mind that canonically, the original Donkey Kong is actually Cranky Kong. So if Miyamoto had stuck to his guns, the old man would probably still be in samurai garb. Maybe his whole family too, if that's the timeline we're living in. Weird to think about. But for better or worse, Hongo's suggestion Donkey Kong won out, and none of them ended up samurai. Did you also know that Ocarina of Time had chain chomps but they were cut at the last minute? Or that the Perfect Dark beta featured a Borg cube from Star Trek? For a whole hour of new N64 facts, check out the video on screen. Special thanks to Jacob for translating, Eurasia M for footage capture, and thank you for watching. See you next time.